Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here on the third day of the discussions. I'm Helen Mountford. I'm President and CEO of Climate Works Foundation. It's a great delight to be here with you. I'd like to thank the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and the Global Methane Forum for bringing us together today to discuss this absolutely critical issue on financing fast climate action. All the important discussions that we've had so far over the course of this conference will come to absolutely naught if we're not able to finance them. So the financing aspect of all that we do is so critical. So I would like to say this is probably the most important session that we've had so far. And we're looking forward to wonderful ideas from all of our panelists about how to take this forward. According to a recent report by the Climate Policy Initiative, CPI, financing to methane abatement was about $11.6 billion in 2019-2020. That's less than 2% of climate finance flows overall. We expect this will have gone up significantly with the Global Methane Pledge last year at COP26, really important, but probably not yet the tenfold that we need to see in order to actually deliver, and certainly not evenly across sectors and regions, some of which really need that financing flows. We have a fantastic panel of experts here today to help unpack these issues and look at how we can really jumpstart financing for fast climate action and get the money to the ground where it's most needed. Even in climate philanthropy, where I work, we've been thinking a lot about how we can play an even better role, a more catalytic role in rapid emissions mitigation, helping to attract in more public and private finance to get it channeled to the right place, and about our role in building social movements and cultivating political will. Really pleased that we have Marcelo here, who's leading the Global Methane Hub, who can share what they're doing with philanthropic investments and helping to move this forward. Everyone on the panel today has been looking at how their institutions can bring more to the table to convert our climate aspirations into reality on the ground and get the financing flowing. I'm looking forward to a very rich discussion and to partnering with all of you as we take this important work forward. But before we start with the panel, I want to welcome to the stage, I have great pleasure in introducing our keynote speaker for this session, Rachel Kite, who's Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a member of Climate Policy Initiative Board. Rachel was one of the first in the finance community to really call for action on short-lived climate pollutants, grasping both the enormous human and societal benefits that would flow from combining air quality protection and climate action, and to center poverty alleviation squarely in both efforts. She's never short of inspirational, and I'm delighted to have her joining us here today to kick us off. So Rachel, over to you.
Okay. Well, it's really lovely to be here on this glorious day in Washington. It's always nice to come back. And it's really lovely to be with you, Helen. Thank you for your stalwart leadership over so many years. And now in the bosom of climate philanthropy, there's no more important place for you to be. It's very nice to be with you all, so many old friends and people who've been on this issue for a long time. And so I offer my remarks with all humility. You're experts, I'm not. I'm just going to poke a few of you. Jennifer, fair warning, right? So obviously we're in a fast mitigation sprint, or we need to be, while we run the deep decarbonisation marathon. And I think it's very important for this community that is capable of holding those two things in the same space at the same time to help others do the same. The sixth assessment report of the IPCC, clearly flags that we're in dangerous territory, flags up the potential overshoot, flags up the issue of tipping points. But we also see from the daily news, I mean, just watching the pictures of Hurricane Ian last night, we can see from the daily news that we're already in that territory of losing crippling amounts of GDP every year, and that number's just going to go up. As the Secretary General struggled last week to get the international community to focus not just on the war in Ukraine and the famine in the Horn of Africa, but what is driving a large part of that, which is the climate crisis, struggling with world leaders that they could hold these two things in the same time, that we have a climate crisis and we have short-term political problems. I think we have to find a way to be able to, again, kick up the communication around the fact that there are short-term things that need to be done, that are on a critical path, that are no regrets investments, while we focus on this long-term narrative about needing to make climate change about everything and everything about climate change. So basically, we need to buy time. And that was always the compelling idea behind the efforts to get financing into short-lived climate pollutants. And of course, is the idea behind the extraordinary work that Marcelo will be leading in the methane pledge. But how do you actually engineer that in terms of finances? But I just want to pay tribute, because I don't think I would have been invited to be here if it hadn't been for the fact that when I was at the World Bank, it's just over 10 years ago now, when I was berated, bullied and bludgeoned by Derwent Zelke and Mario Molina and Professor Ramanathan and the people who understood this issue. And they would, they sent me the paper, then they, realizing that I wasn't reading that, they sent me the short version and the piece that was published, I think, in Science or Nature, that was just 2 pages long. I was like, read this. And Andrew Steer, I was vice president, Andrew Steer was the envoy at the time. He left to go to WRI. But I remember we had a dinner in a Greek restaurant on K Street. And we brought various people from the bank who were kind of important if you wanted to sort of change direction. And it was at that dinner that the penny finally dropped. And it was at that point that we brought the World Bank into the CCAC. And at that point, we set off, I think, some important work. I am deeply hopeful that Jennifer is going to take the bank back into a leadership role on short-lived climate pollutants. Why? Because it's sensible money to spend, because it ticks so many boxes, because it enables so many other things to happen. It brings new people into the room. And for the countries where this really is important, this might be one of the easiest things that they can do in order to build the confidence that they can manage a transition. A large part of this is about persuading leaders that if you break it down into bite-sized pieces, there are things that they can do while they are struggling with an extraordinary debt burden, while they are struggling with the impact of a fossil fuel lobby that will not go away and will simply double down and simply intensify its efforts. And so if you can build confidence within leaders that if we do this, we can make this much difference and it has a positive effect on the economy and on people's health, then you can start a broad conversation. So for me, short-lived climate pollutants, methane and everybody else, this was always a bridgehead. It produced a very immediate effect, but it was also sort of a gateway drug to other things that countries needed to do. So for me, this is personal. I'm really pleased to be here, and I give homage to all of you that work on this issue so doggedly. So let's talk about the position we're in right now in 2022. First of all, peace is a precondition to meeting net zero. This community has to prepare itself for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And this community has to prepare itself for the fact that what Russia is doing as a result of its inability to sell its gas is pushing out methane numbers beyond anything that we would want to see at this point in time. So we have a crisis of flaring that Russia is going to be in a imperiled position in terms of its ability to take its industry and do something with it, no matter how the peace breaks out. And so we have now bought ourselves a new strategic problem that we will have to deal with. This community is going to have to prepare answers for the West, but also for other partners of Russia as we go forward. We often talk about peace in one side and security and climate in the other, or development in the other. These are fundamentally linked. Russia already had one of the leakiest oil and gas industries as it was, and this brings to question how we can drive forward the agenda in terms of flaring and working with the industry. So The other thing that's different now than at the beginning of the climate coalition, the Clean Air Coalition, or the beginning of this agenda is technology. Technology always was our friend, but now it's a supercharged friend, and it keeps us honest. And I think the satellite capability, machine learning and AI now show us that we have fundamentally underestimated leakage from the oil and gas industry in particular, but also showed us the limits of what our understanding was 10 years ago in terms of leakage and emissions from landfills and from other sources as well. So we bring that now to the finance debate. Well, we know that, as the IEA suggests, if annual investment of around $13 billion is needed for abatement, methane abatement from the oil and gas sector, and remembering that some of those costs can be recovered, then I think we have the data and the analysis to be able to have a different conversation with that industry as it makes its net zero pledges and as it starts to be held accountable for those net zero pledges. I don't think there's an oil and gas firm at the moment whose net zero pledge is accurate on the data in terms of what their leakage really is and what their plans are, whether they're commensurate to deal with it. But beyond oil and gas, obviously landfill and waste has to be a bigger emphasis in other countries, and how we work with national companies, not just the majors, becomes and always has been a big problem. Again, data helps us show that global methane emissions will rise substantially from landfill and from agriculture. And it's now time that that gets baked into the work that the World Bank and others would do with countries around their plans and their transitions. So I think that we can embrace both the commercial and the not-profit data world and get really serious working with other initiatives that are committed to transparency and integrity in net zero to make sure that companies don't wriggle out of their ability to actually be able to know what's going on in their own business. There are countries that haven't signed the methane pledge. There are countries that need support. And I think the question is to the international development industry, how do we bring the SLCP, the super pollutant and methane conversation up to the top of the to-do list in dialogue with countries, differentiated by that country? So where is the conversation with India at the moment, especially given that India is subject to one of the JETPs, or one of these new private public platforms that gained so much attention last year in Glasgow as the world focused on South Africa, but now are being rolled out for other high polluting countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Senegal, Egypt. But India may resist the title of a JETP. It wants to have its own plan with international support behind it. But how do we have a sensitive conversation with India, given that its emissions are coming from agriculture, and most of its agriculture is small scale, but nevertheless find ways to help Indian industry and Indian public sector make a difference? And let's put ourselves in the shoes of a mid-sized company in a developing country or in a middle-income country. It's very difficult out there at the moment. There is a plethora of acronyms and initiatives which are swirling around at the top of your supply chain, the one that you're selling into. You don't understand most of them, and you don't know which ones are real, which ones are not, and you don't know whether there's any accountability linked to any of it. There is precious little technical assistance available to you at a reasonable price for you to understand your own net zero transition pathway, or for you to be able to access technology and finance to improve your performance. You are operating well beyond national regulation. Your government may not even regulate, but certainly doesn't enforce. And yet consumers will demand that companies can behave in a certain way. It is confusing. And if we are going to make serious efforts around reducing super pollutants and methane, we're going to have to deal not just with the big guys who work globally, but we're going to have to deal with everybody in their supply chain. And those are, of course, important in the fabric of society in countries that need to do more. And in the last 10 years, the international financial institutions and the development community have walked away from these firms. There's been a shrinking of technical advice, a shrinking of available finance for technical assistance. And if we're going to win this battle, then it has to be a battle that everybody understands their place in. It has to be a battle that everybody feels that they could be part of the winning side. And so there is significant readjustment needed in the way in which we spend public finance, climate finance, development finance, whatever we want to call it going forward. That's not a problem just related to reducing methane emissions or to just reducing black carbon or other SLCPs. It is a broader issue. But given that this is such an immediate issue, and given the fact that we need to make so much progress in the short term on this issue, it becomes one of the leading indicators of whether we're doing better or not. Planting methane and SLCPs in the heart of net zero is also important. I still hear discussions about, well, you know, are all emissions included? I mean, it's somewhat surprising that we would still be having this conversation. Net zero is at risk at the moment as a concept. It's attacked from the street or from the left for greenwashing. It's attacked from the right for being woke capitalism. The truth, of course, is in the middle. But we have arrived at a point where overstatement, exuberance, often in the run-up to a COP, has meant that we have overpromised. What's interesting is that at the same time, the pressure to finance the things that are needed in order to get to net zero isn't just coming from civil society or scientists or for people in developing countries frustrated that they are expected to solve a problem that they didn't cause without precious assistance and being highly indebted. The pressure is also coming now from the financial sector. Why? Well, because last year in November, the financial sector was corralled into a major announcement of $130 trillion under management, 450 companies all committed to net zero. This was, of course, as most of us close in knew, complete bunkum. It isn't $130 trillion. If you actually analyze, who has got a plan to get to net zero, it's probably in the tens of billions. It doesn't mean that it wasn't important. It is important to say that you're going to get there. But what is not possible is that you say you are going to be there or that you are there when you aren't and when you can't describe what that means. So if you're going to sell me a green product, a green can of motor oil or gasoline, and your enterprise is not net zero, you are not net zero, and that product is not net zero. Now, in the developed world, consumer protection bureaus will go after that company. Advertising standards authorities will go after that company. The media will go after that company. Kids on the streets every Friday will go after that company. But for many companies in that supply chain, or for many parts of the world, those protections don't exist. And so we are somewhat vulnerable to overclaiming. But look what has happened. This has spurred well-meaning people to say, that's rubbish, do better, and less well-meaning people to say, aha, here we go, woke capitalism, this isn't going to work for people, this is going to make the economy even more elitist and more exclusionary than we already have. And we're right in that moment. So we have to reclaim net zero by working on integrity, by being real about what we're promising, and by having regulation catch up with the leading edge of the private sector. And where's one of the quickest places to do that, the easiest ways to do that? The things that you're working on right here. If we could finally start catching up on methane and SLCPs, this would make a difference. Which brings me to Catherine's point over coffee this morning, the role of radical transparency. There is nothing more important than putting in the hands of a community the data and the knowledge about what is going on with their air, what is going on with their crop productivity, what is going on with their children's health. We have seen huge leaps forward when that radical transparency has allowed new communities to take this discussion forward, new pressure, new parts of the financial sector understand what's needed. So these are just some ideas. Now I'm going to just put a few things on finance in front of you. the disconnect between the $130 trillion and the drip, drip, drip of climate finance that actually reaches projects which could make a difference in developing countries is the transmission mechanisms and the intermediators. Those intermediators and transmission mechanisms have traditionally been development finance institutions and the multilateral development banks. I'm not here to beat up on them, but they have to do better. And that has been the rallying cry now, not just from the countries that want more help, but from the people who need to be leveraged and crowded in. This is a very different moment in the finance discussion than it was even a year ago, let alone 2 to 3 years ago. I was in New York last week, and I heard Mr. Malpass's comments, and I understand that that was more of a faux pas than a deliberate provocation. But the reason why the world responded the way that it did to that comment is because of the deep frustration that not just the bank, but the whole enterprise of development finance has been the piece that has changed the least since Paris. It has been, an argument about whether or not they are incrementally improving the amounts of money that they move out of the door. And yes, their political owners are to blame for the swinging cuts in development assistance that we're seeing at the moment and the diversion of development assistance to the war in Ukraine. We have to, as I said, be able to hold two things in space at the same time. But there are very practical things, urgent things that the development financial institutions could do under existing management that would make a difference. They can take more risk. We have to ask ourselves whether, at this point in our journey, the AAA rating of a multilateral development bank is more important than being able to put large amounts of cash behind key industries to be able to pivot to being cleaner now. Because I would say to you that as economies brown down and green up, they will meet a moment of sovereign risk. And if they all meet that moment of sovereign risk in the next decade, there is no way the international financial institutions will be able to cope. And so it is in their own interests that they take more risk now. That is not to talk about the human health impacts and the tipping point implications of not doing so. But even at a lower level, can the IFC and the private sector wings of the development banks and EBRD and others who have a long tradition of working with the private sector, should they not be originating to distribute rather than originating to hold? What do I mean? They are on the ground. They are technically capable. They have great, extraordinary staff who understand how to build private sector development. They should be working with industry, with different sectors on the kinds of public-private projects that are needed. And then once they've originated and shaped them and got them into good shape, book them and then hand them off to the sovereign funds and the other institutional investors who have trillions of dollars under net zero pledges, but don't have boots on the ground and can't get down on the ground and do that kind of project origination. 70 years ago, it made sense for the IFC to go into a country, build a private sector project, invest in it and hold it because there was nowhere to distribute it to. That is not the case right now. As I said, we have $130 trillion under assets under management looking for good quality net zero investments. So I could go through the business models of each of the multilateral development banks and point out things that they could do better under current management. And I think this is where we need to be. So I look forward to the annual meetings, to seeing big announcements from the bank, not just in what it's going to do to put oil gas flaring at the top of the agenda in its dialogue with Nigeria, Angola and everywhere else, especially because they are cash rich over the last 8 months because of the rise in gas prices. I'm looking forward to new initiatives about what the World Bank is going to do to help in the fiscal health of cities around the world where landfill is the largest and fastest growing source of methane emissions. And I'm looking forward to the new things that IFAD and the World Bank and everybody can do to support small farmers. So this is important. It has to go first because it's a sprint while we win the marathon, and we will need the institutions that have the cash. As Mia Motley from Barbados said last week, There's $1 trillion in the system that we need to shake loose right now. This is a community that can find pragmatic ways for institutions that have the cash to be able to do something different with it right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for a fantastic kickoff to our discussions today on financing and a real call to action by countries, what we can do in terms of the international financial institutions. And we're lucky to have both Jennifer from the World Bank and Mark from EBRD here who can share with us what they're doing, but also what more they can do along the lines you've outlined. So thank you so much for kicking us off so well with that. Before we pass to the panel, we actually have a special address from Mindy Lubber, who's going to join us virtually. We've got a video address from her. Unfortunately, she hoped to be here in person, but was not able to in our current world environment. That happens to many of us. So Mindy's going to join us with a virtual address. She is the Chief Executive Officer and President of Ceres. For those of you who don't know Ceres, they do fantastic work to mobilize the most influential investors and companies to help solve some of the world's greatest sustainability challenges, including truly shifting finance to support a rapid and just transition to net zero. So if we can cue the video, that would be great. Hopefully.
Good morning, friends. I am sorry not to be with you personally, but with my COVID diagnosis last Friday night after Climate Week, I am now isolating at my home on Cape Cod, but I'm delighted to be with you virtually. So let me talk about the private sector a bit, about what we're seeing in capital markets, as we call them, to act on climate risk, on methane risk, to come along on this journey with us and to help make a difference. Let me start by stating the obvious, and I'm not going to do too much of that. The fundamentals on acting on climate, clearly the human toll and the planetary limitations are beyond words. But the fundamentals on the financial impacts of climate change are also clear, and we all know them. In the first half of 2022 alone, climate-linked extreme weather caused $65 billion in losses worldwide. That's double the losses from the same time period in 2018. And that doesn't include what's going on in the world today, in Cuba, in Florida, with the climatic related changes and the storm damage that we're seeing. That number of 65 billion will double, if not triple. So are capital markets getting it? Given the enormity of the risk and the implications, what are we seeing out there in the capital markets? And let me talk a little bit about it. First, regulators are starting to address this, and they need all of our support. The Securities and Exchange Commission put out a draft rule on mandatory climate risk disclosure. It would get us to catch up with about 8 countries in Europe, mandating that publicly traded companies disclose their climate risk. And once they disclose it, we all have that information. Their investors know if they're well managed. That's the kind of analysis we need every company doing. And every company needs to not only disclose their risk, but for those thousands of companies who are making commitments, we need to ground those commitments, their net zero commitments, into short, medium, and long-term goals that are happening and happening sooner rather than later. And we're seeing more and more of that happening. Second, on climate investments, building out our new economy. The Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure many of you had a lot to do with passing, it is the new silver bullet. The record amounts of funding for investments in clean energy, energy efficiency, sustainable ag and electric vehicles, they are about displacing polluting diesel and gasoline engines in cars and heavy-duty vehicles. That money is about building out a future with clean jobs and a clean energy future. And it's working. It is working now already. In the short term, since that bill passed, we've seen progress. Companies, big companies and venture companies are all stepping up. Toyota investing another $2.5 billion in EV battery factories in North Carolina. First Solar pouring $1.5 billion into building its 4th factory. In 2022 alone, we are on pace to eclipse every other year in venture capital fundraising for climate investing, covering a swath of industries from electric cars and carbon-free cement to green hydrogen. And we're seeing investors come to the table. We're working with 600 investors, $55 trillion in assets under management, who have said they are going to push the 165 largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions to act on climate and to do sooner rather than later. Those investors are asking companies to set short, medium, and long-term goals and to have accountability plans and to be transparent. That's making a difference. Investors are moving the companies in their portfolios. And the investors themselves, 2 years ago, we had no investors who were committed to a net zero future. Now we have 273 investors committed to a net zero future. And those companies and investors are also stepping up. They are understanding that not only do they need to act, put money where it matters, reduce their emissions, but they need to stand with us on public policy. No longer is it okay for a company to say they're going to act, but to be fighting climate-related legislation. Those days are over. It is time to bring together the private sector, and they are coming together and they are acting. We're working with venture companies and we're working with investors and we're working with oil and gas companies. Right now, we are working with ConocoPhillips, Devon, Occidental, and Pioneer in an effort to get them to join the oil and gas methane partnership. In that instance, a voluntary initiative, but measurement-based reporting, a framework that provides greater accountability for oil and gas companies. Oil and gas companies get it that they need to act. They move in quickly enough, not nearly. Last year, we had investors asking Chevron to report on the reliability of its methane emissions disclosure and to encourage more direct methane measurement and action. We got 98% of the votes. 98% of the investors supported that because they knew they needed to act as part of the climate debate. We're seeing more and more happening in the food sector where they are committing to science-based targets and to addressing scope 3. And even this week, we will be working with 15 companies who are coming up to the Hill for Farm Hill Bill Days, a corporate effort to encourage lawmakers on climate smart vision for the 2023 Farm Bill. Are we seeing enough? Not yet, but we are seeing extraordinary progress in moving companies to change, in moving investors to change where they're investing, and in bringing the voice of the private sector into the policy debate. We are not yet there, but there's much we can build on. I look forward to doing that with each and every one of you.
That was Mindy joining us from Cape Cod, where she's isolating with COVID. So it's a shame we couldn't have her in the room, but wonderful to have her insights over video to share with us today. I'd now like to turn to our fantastic panel we have here, starting with Marcelo Mena, who's CEO of the Global Methane Hub. This is really the first of its kind philanthropic alliance to support methane reductions efforts from around the world. Marcelo, tell us, philanthropy plays a big role in spurring change, but clearly can't cover the full costs of what's needed in terms of implementation. So what role do you think the Global Methane Hub can best play in helping countries access financing to carry out the methane abatement that they need to do?
This thing has there we go. Okay, great. Thank you, Helen. And of course, we're great partners with ClimateWorks, which is also a re-grantor, just like the Methane Hub. So first off, the important thing is understanding a little bit of the financing, because obviously, if we want to be funded to a level that we want and be always helping spur change, but really it's not going to be the trillions that are required. And for example, just find some looking at some of our success stories. A good way to reduce methane is actually reducing natural gas demand, for example, or oil and gas demand. Renewable energy today has made great progress this last year. 10% of all the electricity that's powering the world on average is from sun and the wind. And last year, 85% of all new capacity came from renewable energy, and it's going to be 95% until the end of the decade. So it's going to be something that we need to learn from. Subsidies were important, but most of the financing is private, and there's markets that change the lower cost, the carbon pricing, energy auctions, regulations, the difficulty of getting the social license for new power from fossil fuel sources, the shift that occurred in many places with respect to coal. We need to learn from that, because obviously it's a great success story. And understanding the tipping points that are required to overcome having better adoption, spontaneous adoption that really doesn't require additional funding. And for example, the report that we've been mentioning, that the Climate Policy Initiative put together, highlights, for example, that where we expected a lot of the investment to be going, for example, on the energy sector, it's where it's going the least. Only 1% of methane mitigation finance today, as it's tracked, is going to fossil fuel extraction. And so therefore the economic case is not enough. It's supposed to be, but it looks like, having more extraction is even more profitable. If you're looking in the 5-year period, maybe it's good to plug the leaks. If you only care about the next quarter, it's probably better just to extract more oil. And then that's why you need emission standards. That's why you need methane fees. It's just not enough to have an economic case. Second, issues, for example, on food. We've seen that organic waste diversion is really important, but for example, it can't be, landfilling and composting, which have different environmental impacts, can't have the same cost. We need to price pollution. And we've seen, for example, in the case of the Chilean tax and trade scheme, that if we design it correctly, we could actually shift some decisions so offsets could occur, mitigating methane in landfills through organic waste diversion. And so therefore you wouldn't need a subsidy, it's just shifting some of the cost in a way using carbon pricing. And on agriculture, for example, can we find better mitigation technologies that actually improve productivity? And there's many examples of this, with better feeding, better breeding, and methane inhibitors. And so what can we do as philanthropic funding? For example, and there's a project that was incubated in the CCAC called Recicla Orgánicos, a collaboration between Canada and Chile. And essentially the funding was to design organic waste management systems, and maybe 50, 60 projects happened in Chile. And now we have decided to expand this work in other countries in Latin America and hopefully the world. And it's South-South collaboration. It's facing the same challenges that maybe some developed countries have already resolved with incineration, with district heating and other things that may or may not be good for the environment, but essentially it's a different thing when you have going from open dumps to landfilling, and you could cut across the whole thing if you did something towards a more circular economy. Agriculture, just final thing, for example, only 2% of the mitigation you've seen the report is actually going to be cost negative as it stands today. But we could actually do a lot more, but we really need to make it so, for example, if we have methane inhibitors, we really study what they are. And philanthropic funding actually has done the initial funding. It wasn't us. I think it was the 11th Hour has been funding a lot of these seaweed methane inhibitors, but we need to understand this a lot more. And we're leading an effort in increasing research and development on this quite soon. So for example, when the farmer buys a product, knows that feed is actually the reduced methane, which is energy loss, can actually be more milk production. And then therefore the farmer will buy it because it's better for the bottom line. So I think it's really important that we do that. Finally, collaboration. We can put together collaborative efforts for the China work that we're doing. We had 9 different NGOs work and focus on the 3 major emitting sources. And we are going to try to make the best bang for the buck. Every single major philanthropy had operations in China, and major NGOs had that also. And it was good to see who was best prepared to tackle each one of the sources. And we're going to help that. So we have a methane reduction plan from China, hopefully soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcelo, on sharing those Thank you so much for sharing those concrete examples of where you're already seeing initiatives that can be scaled up, South-South learning and collaboration. and that example on China, where it's really about bringing the sum of the different pieces together to ensure we have as much impact as we can in a truly coordinated way. So thank you so much, and for all the work you're doing with the Global Methane Hub. Let me now pass to our next panelist, Jennifer Serra, who has recently been appointed as the Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. She has deep experience in one of the areas which is central to achieving the global methane pledge, i.e. effective wastewater management. That's going to be one of the areas we really need to push forward. So she's coming from an engineering background, very much hope she can bring this sort of pragmatic, practical, hands-on perspective of how to get change in the wastewater sector into tackling methane more broadly with the World Bank. So Jennifer, let me pass to you. What's next on your agenda following the highly successful methane pilot auction facility the World Bank ran before, which is now ended, and also given some of Rachel's gentle pushes to get the World Bank to step up more? What are you aiming to do?
Well, thank you very much, and delighted to be here, and great to get my marching orders from Rachel as I start my new assignment. Rachel's been my boss inside the bank years ago when I was based in Vietnam, and so it's good. It's very helpful to keep me headed in the right direction. So I feel quite a bit of support there, and it's useful. And also, you know, you heard on Monday it was not a very good video connection with our Vice President Jürgen. But really that the World Bank group, I'm speaking on behalf of the World Bank group, IFC, Amiga as well. I mean, we are really, really committed to scaling up our work on methane, on short-lived climate pollutants, and also deforestation. We see that whole package of the fast mitigation sprint. And I think this is really a commitment at every level, and we basically just need to make it happen. You know, it builds on a lot of lessons and experience, as you mentioned, of the methane initiative, but with the work of others. And we know to do this, we need to engage more systematically, and I agree with you, Rachel, at the country level with what we call our client or counterpart governments. That's very, very important. And to work in partnership and all of us coming together. And just let me unpack real quick, because, you know, we want to talk about financing, but you can't just zoom in and talk about financing. I think when we do go engage with the governments, the countries that we work in, I mean, the awareness raising is huge, really, really important. I think the awareness raising and the work that you're doing is very, very important. Rachel, I hear what you're saying. It's behavior. It's at every single level, right? And you know, if you get the whole issue of air pollution, methane high in the agenda, really is a lack of awareness in many countries. And in fact, if we look at, then the next one is analytics and good data. And so how do we work with countries also to drill down and say, where are the quick wins? And the data is very important. Things like the new satellites that we have from EDF, that's super important, but how do you drill that down to the country level? And as we're looking at this, it's very important. We're doing a lot of work on climate change and development reports, CCDRs. So when we're engaging with the countries we're working in, it's where do you get the development benefits and the climate benefits all together, including on methane. So when you are talking about beyond the gas flaring, if you're talking about agriculture and rice production, you're talking about wastewater, you're talking about waste management. I mean, you're talking about many countries that don't even have wastewater treatment. And, you know, so there is an opportunity where do you develop, you can deliver the development impacts as you address the methane and all kinds of greenhouse gases, as well, you know, as building the resilience and adaptation into the package. So the analytics is important. So once you have the awareness and the analytics, then what are the regulatory and policy that need to be fixed in countries to encourage really for people to invest the carrots and the sticks, right? To go ahead with the methane reduction. And then of course you get the measurement and the verification. So, I mean, it's building that whole architecture and not rebuilding in each country, but learning and sharing lessons on that. And then from there, you can drill down into the projects and the programs that can be funded and the partnerships that are needed. And in that sense, we talk about crowding and financing. That's what's very, very important around tangible projects, where you can have the role. You have the grants and the philanthropy, the concessional financing, the private financing, the different types of private financing, as Rachel points out too, that you can have with IFC, one level of private financing and then another one. So let me see, how do we put this in action? And what we think is really important is looking at results-based financing. And I think that's what we learned from the pilot auction facility for methane, is how do you start paying for results? And so we're putting together a new facility, a climate emissions reduction facility, and it builds again on all these lessons of how do you deploy results-based climate finance at scale, so you can help countries meet their climate commitments but also to access carbon markets, both voluntary, including voluntary carbon markets. And that's what's really important, that how do you have high quality emission reduction options so that you can have countries be able to create these projects, the emissions reductions, and then eventually be able to trade them. But let me give a practical example. We were talking about this last night at dinner, and this is rice and methane. And how do you put it together, the country? So again, a program for results. We have an instrument where we're supporting governments, it could be China, Indonesia, Vietnam, UP, and India. We're helping them put together programs that are looking at water saving in low carbon paddy rice production. And there what we realize is you need three components. One, you need the policy and regulatory side that provides incentives. The other one that's really important is understanding farmers and farmer behavior. And why are farmers using so much water and flooding their fields? Because they don't believe that they have a reliable water supply, because the irrigation systems are not reliable. So understanding what gets in the way. So these programs for results target the farmers so that the farmers have better practices, but they also know that they're going to have reliable water supply. So you work with the irrigation providers. So you put it all together, and what you're trying to do is you promote the reduction of GHG, methane and nitrous oxide from the rice fields. You're also improving water and land management and climate resilience, and reducing pollution from rice cultivation. But importantly, you look at how do you increase farm income with higher productivity by reducing the production costs. And that's what you said, Marcel. How do you look at the economics and the win-win so there's incentives around the way? So these are the types of programs that we're trying to put together. And that's more the public sector side of the agenda. But we also see on the private sector side, there's much more we can do. Let me stop there and then come back later if we want more examples. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and for sharing concrete examples of where the World Bank is already moving and scaling up work based on what you learned from the methane pilot auction facility, but also responding to Rachel on how to do this in country, what you're seeing, how to combine policies with understanding farmer behavior, incentives in rice paddies, for example. So thank you for that. We'll definitely come back for more examples, I'm sure. And our final panelist today is Mark Bowman. So welcome, Mark. He's Vice President for Policy and Partnerships at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Mark is no stranger to development policy or to financial policy, having previously worked for DFID and for HM Treasury in the UK. I expect you're quite happy not to be in the latter at the moment, but we'll pass on quickly from that. Mark, building back better from the pandemic crisis and dealing with the financial, energy, food security, and other fallouts from the ongoing war in Ukraine is going to be an enormous job. But we need to do so in a way that we also help to provide the right incentives and opportunities to reduce methane emissions and other short-lived pollutants. How do you see us being able to do that, and what role will EBRD play?
Well, thank you very much, Helen, and real pleasure to be here, and thank you for that introduction. And I think from that introduction of my background, it kind of highlights that I'm not a particular expert in this area in methane, and I have a lot of sympathy for what Rachel was saying about the kind of importance of you know, the two-page summary, condensing the arguments and making the case. But let me talk a little bit about what the EBRD is doing, and then if time to pick up on some of the points and challenges that Rachel put forward. So EBRD, we're a transition bank. We were set up to help economies in Eastern and Central Europe, Central Asia transition to sustainable market-based economies. And climate is absolutely one of our top, I would say, our top strategic priority. We have committed that 50% of our investments will be green investments by 2025. In fact, we achieved that target last year in 2021. Over half of our investments were in climate finance. We've committed to be Paris aligned, our investments to be Paris aligned by the end of this year. And we're also working significantly to scale up what we do in terms of the mobilization of private finance. We on methane, and others have set out very eloquently the kind of importance of action here. you know, the potency of methane, its contribution to climate change, but also the fact that its short-lived nature means that action here can deliver tangible change in the short term. And I very much liked kind of Rachel's focus on this as an area where you can really demonstrate the benefits of taking action, and the kind of really compelling narrative that sometimes the challenge of climate change is seen as so vast you don't know where to start, but this is an area where short-term progress could be very, very tangible and very powerful. At the EBRD, we signed up to the Global Methane Pledge. Very pleased to do that. I guess a question of what does that mean for an MDB to sign up to the Global Methane Pledge, given that we don't emit ourselves. It's a signal that we acknowledge that this is an important area and that we need to do more in this area as part of our overall work on climate, and also a mechanism by which we can encourage our countries of operation to also contribute. And I'm pleased that a fair number, I think 22 of our countries of operation, have signed up to the Global Methane Pledge. In terms of how we approach this, I think it's fair to say that historically we have tended to focus on the energy or the gas sector in terms of what we've done in terms of methane abatement. We've done a lot of work, much of which in conjunction with the World Bank, a combination of technical assistance programs and investments helping countries to introduce national programs. We've done work in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and in Egypt. But as I say, it's tended to be focused on gas and energy infrastructure and gas flaring. And we've done that. I mean, Jennifer kind of set out the importance of the kind of overall architecture there. But the kind of key components of our approach have, first of all, been a focus on science, a focus on measurement, screening, identification of sources of emissions, the setting of national baselines. Second, investment, the direct financing of programs. But third, and critically important, the importance of our policy dialogue and technical assistance, helping our client countries to introduce regulatory frameworks, to introduce targets, to introduce market mechanisms where possible. And I think that's the strength of our approach, is the ability to combine investments with policy dialogue. And we have some good examples of where we've been able to make progress. That having been said, I think this has to be an area of increasing focus, and as we go forward, we need to expand beyond our traditional focus on energy, and also look at other sectors, which include, for example, sanitation and waste, and agribusiness. I know we're going to have hopefully going to have an open discussion now, but just to say that I think Rachel's kind of challenge in terms of the MDBs stepping up, and the kind of the massive collective policy challenge we have of mobilizing the amounts of finance that are necessary to tackle climate change. I think this is an incredibly important debate. It's a debate where it's a very difficult, complex debate, and it's a debate where sometimes I think it's important to kind of get into the detail and the depth and actually work out the role that the MDBs can play. So sometimes it can come across, just as the 130 trillion number was, pretty simplistic. Sometimes the debate itself can be quite simplistic, that, if only MDBs would provide a bit more finance or take a bit more risk, then suddenly this money would flow to projects. In reality, we know that it's more complex than that, and that there are many different constraints, whether they be economic, financial, or importantly, political economy constraints, in terms of why countries are not taking action. And it's the role of the MDBs to work out how we can tackle those constraints. And we can, if we have time, I can give you an example of work that we're currently doing in Egypt, helping them to significantly expand their renewable sector and close down gas-powered power stations, which is an example of having a deep understanding of the country, working with the authorities, identifying the political constraints, and then putting it together as a package, and hopefully in doing so, mobilizing not just IFI money but also private sector money. Let me stop there, but happy to carry on the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing what you're doing at EBRD and moving forward, including that example on Egypt, but also what you've been doing with oil and gas flaring and how to work with countries on the combination of the policy environment, the technical assistance, the data and information to set the baselines, which I think everyone's mentioned the importance of that transparency and that information as a basis. And then I think on those to actually move forward with the right kinds of policies and approaches to actually capture and reduce that leakage, particularly critical in a sector where we do know and in many cases it is actually a no-cost investment. It's a financial benefit, just does not happen without the right policy environment and monitoring. So that is really helpful. I do think it'd be interesting if people are willing to get into a little bit more discussion. We now have time for discussion amongst the panelists, and would love to push a little bit more on this question of the role of different types of actors, particularly the development finance institutions, philanthropy. How do we actually ensure the funding, the public funding that goes through the DFIs, the work of philanthropy can really be complementary and catalytic and leverage private finance so we can bring it to the table? Mindy already told us what's happening in the sort of private finance side, where we're trying to do big pushes to get much more risk disclosure, climate risk disclosure, trying to get more investment flowing and more awareness. But what roles can we play with this public finance and philanthropic funds, I think would be great. How do we actually structure that in a way that works, and for different sectors, right? Oil and gas is going to be one type of approach in terms of methane reductions. We also have what needs to happen in agriculture, what needs to happen with waste, with wastewater. All of these are different areas and will need different types of financing and approaches, as I think our panelists have outlined. But let's come back to this question on the role. And I wonder, Rachel, since you sort of kicked us off with some fantastic remarks and definitely a couple of urges, do you want to take this up?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that while public money is constrained, more so now than perhaps most of the time in recent years, it has to go places that other money won't go, and so it has to do things that other money won't do. It also then has to crowd in and leverage. And so, just on the first point, most cities in the world, and especially most cities in developing countries, are not in good fiscal health, right? They're not solvent in most cases. And there's an extraordinarily important role for regional development banks and the World Bank Group in working out how you get investment into cities if landfills, for example, and other forms of municipal and obviously Jennifer's got 30 years of history in the water sector. What does, and that's not going to be something where BlackRock's going to be coming in and spraying cash around, right? So I think that how do you make sure that the risk appetite is there in the board and the owners of these institutions, and that enough of the funding is going to go in that? So it's we've got a critical path. That's a very important thing that has to be done. How does that rise up to the top of the to-do list? And then how do you make that? And then how do you incentivize the staff to take the risk to do projects which are extremely difficult and extremely risky, and make sure that staff are aligned to go and do that important work? So one. Two, the leverage. One of the problems that the bank group has, it's not Jennifer's problem, but the institution has, is it has never met its leverage numbers. For more than 20 years, we've been talking about getting that public money to leverage more, both in the most concessional window, IDA, IBA, that has one. I mean, we have got to stop talking about this and figure this out once and for all. And I think that's, you know, that's sort of, Jennifer's going to be important in that, because the climate imperative is one reason to do that. But these are things above her pay grade. No disrespect. And the same for EBRD. The third thing is then what do you do with this oil and gas industry? We are subsidizing it more today than we were 2 years ago. The IEA numbers on fossil fuel subsidies are horrific, right? We are now all then going back into gas because we've got a war, and I mean, I've never heard so much rubbish said about short-term solutions to the energy crisis and the desire to sort of open up new gas fields, as I heard last week. But most of these companies and countries that are exporters have got windfalls, and those windfalls have to be used. And of course, there's conversations now going on around using windfalls for loss and damage and windfalls for adaptation. But honestly, if the industry can't sort out its own methane leakage problem with all of the cash that's rolling around, then I think we need to reset that debate. And that's obviously a public discussion. But then for developing countries, you know, I think that the extraordinary work that the Gas Flaring Initiative team do in EBRD and the bank in particular, you know, they've been doing stalwart work, you know, with very little political updraft, honestly, for the last decade. And, you know, that should be front and center in any discussion with Nigeria or any discussion with Angola about what a country plan looks like, or what other support those countries are going to get to expand their gas fields, which is what they want from the bank at the moment. I mean, you know, so let's have a coherent debate. But I think on the fact that there is things that public money has to do that nobody else is going to do, those are risky things to do in terms of just incentivizing a bureaucracy. And I think there's an opportunity to do much more there.
Thank you, Rachel, and I'll pass back to others on the panel in just a moment. I do want to take up your point on the subsidies that are continuing to go to fossil fuel production, exploration, and consumption. Actually, I was looking up one of my old reports, and 25 years ago, a few years ago, 25 years ago, I was working on a report at OECD that we did to finance ministers on environmentally harmful subsidies, which laid out why these subsidies, whether fossil fuels or agriculture or water, were trade distorting, economically inefficient at getting to the people that they're meant to support, farmers, workers, etc., and of course, environmentally harmful. So I have to say 25 years later, and here we are, and the OECD IEA numbers that came out last year for 2021 for fossil fuel subsidies and tax breaks, direct subsidies and tax breaks to fossil fuels, almost $700 billion. That was double the year before. That's the 2021 numbers. We have not even seen the 2022 numbers with all that's happened with the Ukraine crisis. I do think this is a moment where the transparency, the openness around those numbers, at a time when developed countries couldn't get together to actually deliver the 100 billion that had been promised for far too long on climate finance, but also at a time where they're not putting in place the regulations and policies that are needed on oil and gas flaring. This is a moment when those subsidies are going to these companies to support the companies, and we can put in place the policies and regulations. So, you know, backing the work that colleagues at EBRD, at World Bank are doing, and really put in place the conditions. So I think some more transparency and openness about that, and just to say this is, you know, enough is enough. Let me pass over, Mark, you'd like a word. Over to you, and then
I just wanted to add to that point. I mean, clearly, you know, fossil fuel subsidies, subsidizing production, subsidizing consumption is going in completely the wrong direction. The other angle to this is that one, I mean, I'm not naive about the politics of this at all, but one problem is carbon and emissions not being priced correctly, and you know, that would be the most significant thing, to price carbon correctly in order to make the economic incentives right. And if you look at you know, this debate about what needs to be done to mobilize private finance to climate projects in emerging countries, and this debate about whether, you know, the MDBs should be taking more risk or de-risking projects, if these projects are fundamentally uneconomic because carbon is not priced correctly, then that model doesn't work. It requires a continual subsidy. It's not a question of MDBs de-risking projects, they're fundamentally uneconomic and they don't make a return. So private finance will not flow to them. So getting the policy framework right, whether it's tax and subsidies or regulation, is a very, very critical component of this debate.
No, I fully agree. The subsidy issue is a huge one. It's not just on the fossil fuels, it's also the agriculture subsidies throughout the world. Huge agriculture subsidies, and which also, the overuse of fertilizer and the whole effect that it has on the environment. So the subsidies is a big issue. Methane, obviously, oil and gas is the big elephant. For us as the World Bank, we're committed. We don't fund fossil fuels, and it's important for us. So what we do there, we do have this gas flaring initiative, but there is a political issue for us too. That's very, very important. We say, look, if we want to help to reduce the gas flaring, we also have to understand we're not engaging upstream, downstream, but that is an important part of the debate. And I think what's also important is to show really good solutions. So a lot of times when we're working with, the countries that we're working in, the lower and middle income countries, of course, there's always, everyone's pointing fingers everywhere on this climate debate. But I think the more that you can see in the United States and Europe and the big emitters, the solutions that they are doing, that they're putting forward, that really, really helps us when you go work in the countries we're working in. But let me bring it down a little bit. I'm very practical. Rachel talked about cities, fiscal constraints in cities. So if we're going back, looking at the wastewater and waste management, the landfills, how do you actually design projects that can crowd in different types of financing? And I think that's really important. And as Mark says, you have to look at the economics of all the projects through the whole cycle. So if you look at, you have to break it down. You really have to get into the details, right? You have to collect the garbage. You have to, some of it you reduce, recycle, whatever. You have to wait to collect it from the households, either the garbage, or it could even be the wastewater or the pit latrine, empty it, right? Many people don't even have connections to sewers, right? Then you need to transport it, and then you need to treat it either in a landfill or in a wastewater treatment plant. And then you need to deal with either you can collect the methane, or you can, ideally if you had a carbon market, you could sell the credits. If you're treating wastewater, you can actually reuse the water, which is becoming more and more important. And you also have some organic matter that can be reused as fertilizer. So there's a whole way of looking at ways of waste as a resource, right? So breaking it down and looking at it that way, and then you see where are the biggest risks, right? And the risks are the household collection, the pricing obviously is a risk of collection, but you can ring fence certain investments, like the wastewater treatment plant, where you pay, a private sector could come in, payment for results. There's probably going to be some kind of guarantee mechanism as well on the policy side and the pricing side. But that's where you really need to get down into the details of looking at the whole chain, saying this is where the public sector risk will come in. This is where the private sector can come in and step in with specific investments that are less risky. And again, we really think the results-based payment is very useful there. And then the carbon market, the pricing for carbon is incredibly important, where you have these fiscally constrained cities and countries. And that's what we had the Africa caucus of the Board of Governors of the World Bank. They said, don't leave us behind. If there are going to be carbon markets, we don't want to be left behind. We want to be able to be part of this system. So I think I would just reiterate what Mark's saying. There is a role for everyone. And that's where also the grant financing, the philanthropy has to come in too, kind of to help prime the pump, to set up these, to do the analysis, to set up the projects and programs, to also jumpstart some of these carbon markets and pay for the credits with grant resources initially, until there is actually a market that will come in from the private sector and others. So let me just stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And I think that the push towards sort of the results-based payments, but also how you look at this in a city environment, all the different aspects is an important one. I do think, it would be good to know from the World Bank perspective, for example, in the work in wastewater, is that something where there are wastewater projects, do you always bring in a perspective on how to reduce methane? Is that already integrated into all that you're doing there?
Thank you, sorry. Great question. Perfectly honest, we're going to do that going forward. We have not been doing that. And so now that's why this is so important. The work that you're all doing, the science there, the pushing us, the Rachel's pushing us, it's something tangible, practical we can do, right? And then also, but if there's a way to pay for it, that's the important part, right? And if it becomes something that
Mhm.
becomes a resource, not an additional cost, then that makes it a lot easier.
Absolutely, good to know. And Mark, just back to your question about the projects that are uneconomic, and certainly the massive subsidies are going in the wrong direction in agriculture and in fossil fuels, absolutely. But I mean, there are quite a few opportunities on fast pollutants that are actually economic, but require some of that investment, that information, that knowledge up front. So the more we're able to bring all of that in to internally, I believe EBRD has an internal carbon price, to actually apply that and to be able to correct would be great. But I do want to pass back to Marcelo as well, who's mentioned a bit on what is needed in terms of pricing and what can be done. And the Chilean example, I think, is a really exciting one. So would love to hear a little bit more from you, Marcelo, on both the Chilean example, but where you see this going with respect to methane. We have here in the US as well a methane fee coming in.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so on the carbon pricing, so 8 years ago, we had the first carbon tax and we need to update the value, right? We had $5 a ton and we expanded the types of pollutants that would be covered. The pricing of pollution was a central portion of reducing industrial emissions, the unregulated sectors, which is something I think you should never overlook. The fact that we priced PM at $200,000 a ton caused mitigation to occur by the next year, way faster than any command and control emission standard. But I just wanted to say briefly on the equation we always have to solve is increased capital costs that come at savings, right? So cities figured it out in some way. LEDs are installed, you pay the same energy that you used to pay for, you don't have to pay for the more expensive LEDs, and you keep the savings. ESCO model for solar rooftop, PPAs. You have right now in many markets in the world, including in Chile, you don't have to pay for the installation, you pay for the energy, and so you're not locking your capital, you're using your operational expenditures. So I think it's really important that we take that into mind how we design this down the line. For example, California, I love California's policy, but it's not really replicable because not any country is going to have 40 billion to spend on like digesters, right? And so therefore they're running into the pipeline of projects is not just, they just don't have enough projects to get the methane emission reductions. Whereas an operational expenditure solution, for example, a methane inhibitor, something that a farmer could buy, every year, is probably way more applicable globally. If we make that breakthrough, then we'll just have farmers add this to the vitamins and the methane will be reduced. And that's what we have to aspire to. If we think it's going to be the $300 billion of national budget, it's never going to happen. Now, on the other side, fossil fuel subsidies, we got to get rid of them. But at one point, I think we could come is something in between. Of course, when we were in the Coalition of Finance Minister for Climate Action, and we launched it, the Ecuador minister was the carbon pricing champion, but he didn't last long because and I'm sure the French minister was looking at us like, yeah, you better be careful with the fossil fuel subsidies or carbon tax and how you portray them, right? And it's really important that we have that conversation in earnest because it's a real pressure point today. But what we can't forget today in Chile, each car gets subsidized $1,000 per year with the fossil fuel subsidy that we have now. So when the OECD numbers does 2022, they're going to come with a really shocking value that we're actually spending more on fossil fuel subsidies than we ever did on climate finance. And that's a bad thing. But what we could do is that as we have a subsidy and like a collection fee method, then the new equilibrium point, we settle on, let's say back $1.20 a liter. Now it's like $1.50. We settle on that. And then anything that's under that, keep the price up and have actually that be a carbon fee instead of a climate the subsidy that is today. So the new equilibrium point could be a fine because people got already used to paying for more than $1 a liter of diesel, and they used to be paying a lot more. So then you could just keep it at that and collect. Maybe that's a feasible way, or just lower the cost of life directly. Why do you want to subsidize SUVs, really? And when you really are wanting to subsidize the cost of life of people that are it's increasing because of fuel costs, right?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Marcelo, and for sharing those insights. we're reaching the end here. I'm going to just say a few very quick remarks. I'm in no way going to try and summarize this fantastic discussion, but I'm going to warn the panelists, I will pass to you each for one brief sentence on what you're going to do differently around methane and financing as you leave this room, what you're going to do in your institution or your own work. So let me just say a few things. I mean, we covered a huge amount of ground here. I think one of the things that was very important was that emphasis on awareness raising, and particularly as we're looking at some of the institutions that do the financing, actually building capacity, understanding internally on where the opportunities are for reducing methane emissions, what they work out to be in terms of the economics. We know there's a good economic case in many cases, but actually it's quite difficult to do sometimes on the ground as you look into the details. A number of panelists raised that. How do we bring in the science, the information, the capacity building, understanding of the economics and the social benefits, and how do we actually use that well? There is a good economic case in many cases, but it's not being unlocked. So how do we do that? We talked a bit about some of the technologies that are actually now enabling transparency, and that gets to both what this means for accountability for companies, whether it's oil and gas companies. It gets to what we talked about and Mindy highlighted on the finance sector and being able to understand climate risks, how to integrate these, how to hold companies, different governments and others to account, and the finance sector. So that transparency is important, that radical transparency. It's also incredibly important for actually building the interest, the buy-in of the public for the actions that we need and to counter what we're seeing in terms of fossil fuel lobbying around the world. We need public buy-in and understanding and ability to step up and demand action from their policymakers to switch so that policymakers don't have to turn up and talk about carbon pricing and then immediately get kicked out, right? So that they can stay in place. And then finally, we did spend a lot of time talking about the role of the development finance institutions, the role of philanthropy, how we can actually work better together and also leverage more private finance as we go forward. And I think there's a lot more to be done there, but a really good conversation. And thank you to all the panelists for engaging in that, including some tough discussion. I really appreciate that. But I am going to go down the line now. Am I allowed to start with you, Rachel? And just say, one thing that you're going to do differently coming out of this.
So I'm wearing two hats today. So CPI will continue to try to bring that transparency to the numbers. And then with my academic hat on, we have a climate policy lab that is working with a number of countries on the actual policies, the levers that you can pull in which order in order to get to your net zero. So you've got your goal, you've got your NDC, but how do you actually maneuver your way through the policy? I think that methane is bedded into that. SLCPs, I think, could be a bigger focus, and we'll do that. And I'll keep chatting with Jennifer about some of the things that she's going to be able to do, even if she doesn't know it right now.
Jennifer, it's clear that Rachel still thinks she's your boss, but thank you, Rachel. Thanks for doing that. Okay, over to Marcelo.
I think I'll take the climate policy initiative's recommendation to work with MDBs to design these project preparation facilities for methane mitigation. The State Department announced some collaboration last week for the African Development Bank, and I think we could do a lot more with other MDBs. So that's what we'll do.
Thank you. Jennifer, over to you.
Continue to listen to Rachel. As long as you do it privately, not publicly. Right? No, I think it's really important really to get the methane into all the analytics we're doing, definitely the diagnostics, but to work in partnership because, a lot more knowledge in this room on the science and the solutions.
Mark?
Yeah, definitely to work in partnership. But I guess our challenge is we've made this commitment to increase our focus in this area by signing up to the Global Methane Pledge, and we need to make that real. And that's about increasing across all of our investments, increasing our focus on where we can reduce methane emissions, and also supporting the countries where we work in terms of them having a coherent approach to it.
Thank you very much, Mark. And from the Climate Works Foundation side, I'd like to say we will continue to work with all of you, collaborating together. We love that idea, the focus on partnership, collaboration, how we can work best together to really continue this fast mitigation sprint as we also work towards deep decarbonization. It's not one or the other. We must do them together. Thank you so much all. Wonderful to see you. Wonderful panel.
So good morning again. My name is Chandrasekhar Sinha. I'm an advisor at the Climate Change Group of the World Bank. I have had to step in place of my colleague who was not feeling very well. So I'll try my best to live up to his level of expertise and moderation. So bear with me. I think the idea of the session today at this point of time is to talk about financing fast action. And we have a number of very exciting speakers who will talk a little bit about the range of issues, and then the last set of panelists will discuss and reflect a little more on what the speakers have spoken. So the format is that we'll have, one round of speakers that you see right now here. Following this, we talk about a little more on the partnerships arrangement, and then follow that up by the panel discussion and reflection on some of the key issues. The idea right now is to talk a little bit about the challenges on financing action with particular reference to methane. And we have Bella talk about that, and I'll come back to that, and then have Bala and Kevin and Manfredi talk a little bit more about the key issues that are there on the investment side, on the enabling environment side, and then on the measurement side. So we'll give the floor to Bella Tonkanogi. I hope I get the name right, to set the scene with regard to the financing and set the context for the other speakers. The floor is yours, Bella.
Thanks so much. Excellent pronunciation. It's really a pleasure to be here today to give this context around methane abatement finance. So I work with an organization called Climate Policy Initiative. I think you heard a little bit about it from Rachel Kite in the previous panel, but just to give you a little bit of background, for over 10 years, CPI has been helping governments, businesses, and financial institutions address climate change while driving economic growth. And we're known for our work in tracking and analyzing sustainable investment trends, which is what I'm going to talk about here, and also identifying innovative financial models and solutions that can drive a transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy. And of course, methane is an absolutely critical component of that. So on the next slide, please. So as we all know, climate science tells us we need to decarbonize the global economy by mid-century at latest. Our latest climate finance tracking report, which is global, all climate finance, shows annual financial flows aimed at climate solutions, reaching a little more than $630 billion a year on average. And that's that little blue rectangle on the bottom left of the screen. And so what that shows is that climate finance has been increasing over the last 10 years, which is great news. At the same time, the rate of change is actually slowing. So we've seen some plateauing in the last 4 years. And then when you look at, when you compare to the needs, so that's that purple line way up above that little rectangle, then you really see that we're falling very short on climate finance overall and where we need to be. So if you go to the next slide then, so just to come to the topic, we're here today to discuss methane. So I think everybody in the room knows that sharp and rapid reductions in methane emissions this decade are essential to limiting global warming to 1.5. And so CPI was really pleased to have the support of the Global Methane Hub to publish earlier this year the first of its kind analysis on the landscape of methane abatement finance, which aims to assess global investment in methane abatement activities and create a baseline against which we can measure progress over time. So the study focuses on existing and established abatement solutions in 3 broad sectors: fossil fuels, waste, and agriculture. And together, these sectors, I think, as you all know, account for 95% of human-made methane emissions. Let me just note that there was a big team behind this report led by Paul Rozan, who's our colleague in Europe. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a big team that worked on this study. So moving to the findings on the next slide. So the findings are stark. Despite methane's outsized contribution to global climate change, finance for methane emissions abatement only accounts for less than 2% of total global climate finance, or just over $10 billion annually. So that means that we need a 10-fold increase in flows to the $120 billion that has been estimated to be needed from both private and public sources annually. And then if you look at those 3 sectors, fossil fuels, waste, agriculture, or and fossil fuels, you see that across all the sectors we're falling quite short. So let me share now a few of the other findings. On the next slide. So one thing I think that's been quite interesting and a bit of a wake-up call in this study is that not only are methane abatement solutions underfunded, but they're underfunded when you look also, and especially when you look at their climate mitigation potential. So other climate change solutions with kind of similar mitigation potential, like renewable energy and low carbon transport, proportionally have far more investment than methane abatement measures. So even though they're all underfunded, when you think about the bang for your buck in terms of mitigation potential, you have even less methane abatement finance than we should be. And then where does it end up? So regionally, so if you go to the next slide, first, where does it come from? And then where does it end up? So this is what we call CPI's Sankey of climate finance. It's a way we use to show our climate finance data and flows from the sources of climate finance. So that's what you see on the left side, all the way through to their uses, and finally to their destination, so the region that these flows are going to. It's a lot of data. I'm not going to go through everything that's on this slide, but just to highlight 2 things. So one, where does finance come from? So that's the left-hand side. So we see that the private sector is accounting for the majority of tracked financial flows, and that's particularly in more mature segments with stronger or well-established commercial viability. And then within the public sector, development finance institutions are a key source of financing, accounting for 13% of all methane abatement. And then where does the finance end up? So regionally, most methane emissions originate in East Asia and Pacific. And actually, as you can see on the right-hand side, so that bottom right rectangle, that's where most investment is going to. So that's, that's okay news. But what we're seeing is that there's significant abatement potential in Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa, which are respectively the 2nd and 3rd largest methane emitters, but combined attracted just 6% of total methane abatement finance. So with those regions, you have much higher emissions and much lower financing than is needed. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, of course, and I'm hoping that we get to talk about some of those on the panel. So on the next slide, please. Now, overall, our findings show that the limited existing investment flows are not being directed necessarily to the sectors of highest abatement potential. So for example, dramatic reductions in methane in the fossil fuel sector are critical to maintaining the 1.5 aligned pathway. And the mitigation potential in the sector is large, with the IEA estimating that it's technically possible to avoid 75% of methane emissions from this oil and gas sector, and with a significant proportion of those avoided at no net cost, especially in today's high gas price environment. But despite having that greatest potential, tracked investment to reduce methane emissions from the sector is less than 0.5%. So half of 1% of methane abatement finance. So that falls well below the needs, which are on average estimated of over $30 billion annually. So I think, you know what, these numbers are always very stark and, you know, a little bit depressing, but I'm really looking forward to talking in the rest of this panel about solutions. And that's the last slide of this presentation. You know, how can we make progress? So, you know, we bucket that into 3 areas. So first is around enabling environment so that's the policy environment for methane mitigation projects with enhanced regulatory signals, binding policy tailored to these key sectors and minimum standards and penalties. And then incentives to uptake both established technologies as well as direct spending for R&D and emerging solutions. At the same time, what we're seeing is a lot of private sector financial institutions and companies are making these ambitious net zero and 1.5 aligned commitments by 2050, but we haven't seen them isolate methane in those commitments. So can we work with those actors to try to bring methane into those commitments and monitor in their own portfolios how much, where methane emissions are and help them incentivize their portfolio companies to reduce methane emissions. And thirdly, it's really, you know, I think as all of you know, really important to have transparency in reporting, both on emissions, but also on capital expenditures and investments in this area. So just to conclude, I would really like to emphasize that methane abatement finance has one of the highest impacts in reducing global warming per dollar of capital invested. We can't avoid the worst impacts of climate change without sufficient finance flowing towards abatement finance or methane abatement. So I really look forward to learning about some of these solutions from all of you today, and thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Bella. That was a very crisp presentation highlighting the challenge we face and the opportunities that exist and the need to scale up finance. I think the numbers are stand out for themselves. And the recommendation or the suggestion from Bella on the enabling environment is where I hope our next speaker, Balabapa, from the Federal Ministry of Environment in Nigeria, will at least cover some of it in his reflections on the challenges itself and what potentially countries can do in order to move forward. So, Bala, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Nigeria is an oil and gas country, and we are signatories to the Paris Agreement as well as the global stage. And we have some policies and measures that will drive the country to achieve the targets we are committed to. But as the previous speakers said, finance is very critical to achieving these targets. And as a country, we have identified some sources of financing to achieve these targets, including the national budgets, because even the Paris Agreement is based on conditional and unconditional. So we identified those projects that could be achieved through financing the finance through national budgets, and then those that can be implemented through support from international donors, the NDC partnership, and the climate finance organizations, and then the private sector. And as Bella said, the contribution of the private sector in Africa and especially in Nigeria is not very significant. But the NDC partnership, which is assisting in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, also saw this problem and appointed a finance advisor and an economic advisor to help to unlock, the contribution of the private sector. So, and it's good also to mention here that the CCAC is supported Nigeria to develop an action plan to reduce short-lived climate pollutants, including methane. And we identified 22 mitigation measures which were approved by the Federal Executive Council and are being implemented at the moment. And 3 of them are measures that will reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector, including reduction of gas flaring and emissions from fugitive methane. So with this, the efforts are being made to mobilize, resources to implement these measures, and we are working to see how we can work with the private sector to improve their contribution to the financing of. Thank you.
Just as a follow-up on this, Bala, in terms of the government's actions itself, what do you think could be, we've heard you talk about the capacity building and support from entities such as the NDC partnership, but from a perspective of the government enabling framework and regulation, what are the things that you think is important lesson for other countries to think about?
Yeah, to achieve this, the NDC partnership appointed an NDC partnership coordinator in Nigeria, working with the NDC partnership coordinator for Africa. So, and we have an NDC implementation team, and we also have an NDC SLCP team, because our SLCP mitigation measures were incorporated into our revised NDC, and the measures in the oil and gas are part of the measures that will be implemented. We have SLCP targets, including methane targets, which were committed to the NDC and also committed to the methane pledge. So we are working together with the NDC implementation team to see that we achieve these targets.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now let's turn to the private sector perspective and hear from Kevin Massey, the Vice President for Corporate Climate and Sustainability at Equinor. Kevin, from your perspective, how do you see scaling up investments for the methane or SLCP reductions, or more broadly?
I'm not sure if this is on. Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Equinor, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is a Norway-based global energy company that has a portfolio of businesses, energy business around the world, including oil and gas, increasingly wind and solar, and also low carbon solutions. And Equinor as a company has an ambition to be a leader in the energy transition. And I think one of the key elements of that ambition is focusing on emissions from the production of oil and gas. Equinor values the opportunity to be part of this conversation, and also the ongoing relationship we've had with CCAC and UNEP, and as a founding member of the OGMP. I just want to spend my 5 minutes to talk a little bit about methane as seen from Equinor, but then some of the drivers that we see in the external environment that we see as being conducive to addressing some of the challenges that Bella laid out and the opportunities for methane abatement in the oil and gas sector. Equinor's methane intensity is industry leading. We have methane intensity of 0.2% of produced volumes, and we're proud of that. Many of the reasons for that are because of our production being predominantly in the Norwegian continental shelf, and I'll talk about some of the drivers and kind of frame conditions that that mean that methane is in a way designed. Methane considerations are designed in terms of technology and also project design from the beginning to allow us to avoid many of the challenges that others see. But we also have a portfolio of oil and gas investments outside of Norway, and we're working hard to focus on methane both in our operated production and in our non-operated production. But let me talk about Norway for a second. There are some things about the kind of physical reality of our Norwegian portfolio that means that methane is very low. Methane intensity and absolute methane emissions are very low from our Norwegian production. For example, of the 9 core sources of methane that are identified by OGMP technical guidance documents, 4 of them are not present in our Norwegian operations. That's partially because of the physical nature of the production that we have, the reservoir properties, the fact that much of our production, all of our production, is offshore in Norway. We have a relatively short distance to market, but also that we design in from the beginning and use the best available technology for our installations. And it's I think that's an important element of the challenge. The reason for much of this is then also related to regulation. In Norway, we've had a ban on routine flaring since 1971. We've had a carbon price in place since 1991, which includes both combusted and cold vented gas. And I think that's an important point. In Norway, there is a differentiated approach to regulation when it comes to combusted emissions versus vented emissions. And I think that is important when looking at the regulatory framework for the methane challenge. For example, that the cost of a ton of CO2 emissions in Norway is around $70 a ton. The cost for a ton of methane emissions is $1,700 per ton, which is higher than we're seeing. It's very good to see the recent passage of federal methane regulation here in the US. But even as we look ahead at the methane fee that is associated with the Inflation Reduction Act, even the highest fee associated with methane here is not as high as what we're seeing in Norway. So regulation is a key driver. But I think in addition to technology and system design and regulation, I think there's a final element in the industry that's really, I think, beginning to become central, and that's mindset. Equinor is a member of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a coalition of 12 major oil and gas producers, and the OGCI recently launched an initiative called the Aiming for Zero Methane Initiative, which is a big step. It's an ambitious initiative across a very disparate group of companies. But the essential focus and kind of thesis is that companies will now address the challenge of methane in the same way that they address the issue of safety, which is aiming for a zero tolerance mindset when it comes to methane emissions. The initiative is gaining pace. We've seen now additional companies, non-OGCI companies, signing up to this. And so in addition to this focus on getting to zero, aiming for zero by 2030, OGCI is focused on taking methane on across a broad range of dimensions, investing in technologies through the OGCI Climate Investment Fund that are specifically focused on methane detection, methane mitigation, and also working with countries where OGCI companies have a presence to conduct satellite monitoring campaigns. We've just seen a monitoring campaign this year in Iraq. OGCI will be publishing a white paper on the results of that before COP27. And next year, we're going to take that pilot project forward into several other countries, including Kazakhstan, Egypt, and Algeria, and really using the best available technology, monitoring technology, to work out kind of where the super emitters and where the really big opportunities are, and then working with partners and governments to tackle the challenge. But I think I'll leave my framing comments there, but we're very happy to be part of the conversation and look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Kevin. Regulation, carbon pricing, changing mindset. 3 key takeaways from what Kevin has indicated. I'll now turn to how data can potentially drive investment of the private sector and request Manfredi Caltagirone, another challenging last name, so forgive me if I messed it up, to talk about this. Manfredi is the head of the International Methane Emission Observatory at UNEP, and I would love to hear what the most recent trends are on data and how that can drive investment. Over to you, Manfredi.
Thank you. Impressive pronunciation, so thank you for that to start. Let me start by thanking the Global Methane Initiative and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to bring us together after a few challenging years in which the methane community had not had the opportunity of being in the same room and take stock of where we are and more importantly where we need to go. And let me also thank Bella for presenting the work of the Climate Policy Initiative and really highlighting how this is an extraordinary opportunity that we need to to take advantage of, both from a climate and clean air, but also from a financial perspective. And indeed, so we have heard from colleagues about the importance of government and private sector action. I would argue that at least in the private sector, in the fossil fuel industry, that is where most of the reduction potential is in the next 10 years. It is really more important to build a system that allows for transparent and trust to be for trust to be there among the different members of the ecosystem rather than direct finance. And I'm gonna provide a couple of examples. So both Bala and Kevin mentioned the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. That is initiative that IMEO manages that was jointly launched with the CCAC or by the CCAC in 2014. And that currently covers 85 plus companies representing around 35% of global oil and gas production. And but not only focused on upstream, but also mid and downstream organizations. And under the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0, companies, these 85 companies have taken very short-term objectives to reduce their emissions by, we suggest around 45% by 2025 and 60 to 75% by 2030, in line with what the IEA says it's technically achievable. Or an intensity target in the range of what the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative has identified, and that effectively is one of the leading global targets around the world. So we're seeing actions or at least commitments being taken by companies. You won't surprise this audience that, and I hope we won't offend Kevin, that the fossil fuel industry in general has not been the most constructive actor on climate change over the last decades, and that it is important that the community at large has confidence about the actions that they take as a result. And so with the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0, we have established a system under which companies have committed to not only report their emissions for both their operated and non-operated assets, so taking responsibilities for not only their operational control, but also for their financial investments, but to do so in a way that it's at an unprecedented level of granularity and accuracy. And so they have committed to achieve a combination of source level measurement and site level reconciliation of those bottom-up measurements for two reasons. One is that transparency is important, but it needs to be focused towards an end. And the end from the UN Environment Program perspective must be reducing emissions to the level that the technology allows. And once again, between now and 2030, the vast majority of emission reductions that needs to be achieved will happen in the oil and gas sector. And so to be able to do so in a transparent and reliable way that provides confidence to the rest of the community. The second element is that only the combination of source level and site level measurements allow us to understand where mitigation action needs to focus in the short term. And so to reach this high level of reductions, it is important to have a very intimate understanding of where emission comes from, and to the extent possible, try to be less reactive and more proactive in terms of reduction. And I think this movement, this transparency framework and this transparency approach has also generated enough information that can be used by other entities to require and to encourage companies to do more and to widen the group of companies that are taking these commitments. Obviously, 85 companies under OGMP is a very encouraging start, but it needs to be a start. We need to be increasing the engagement to the vast majority of the industry. And for example, I'm going to stop here, but for example, lately the United Nations Finance Initiative that manages a number of investor groups that are committed to net zero has singled out methane as an important indicator that companies must report on, and again based on measurements. We have heard this morning from the executive director of Ceres about the importance of investor pressure. So for the international oil companies, or for those companies who are operating in market economies, it is certainly important to have this further pressure from investors and commitment from them to both mitigate and to do so in a way that is transparent. And we also need to work now and I think the Global Methane Pledge is a great start to translate the ambition that governments have agreed to in the Global Methane Pledge to the reality of operations on the ground, and so make sure that the national oil companies have the resources they need to make the investments that are necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Manfredi. I think from the oil and gas sector and the critical role potentially that the oil and gas sector will play in addressing some of the challenges that Bella talked about, we'll move over to partnerships. So you would notice from the agenda that we have three set of panelists coming in to present their views. So please join me in thanking the speakers right now, and we'll request the next set to come in while we move forward. Thank you. From as I indicated, from the discussion around the oil and gas sector, the challenges of climate finance for methane mitigation, I think the role of partnerships, I think Bala brought it up, the partnerships are important. I think, could I request the panelists from Switzerland and Ghana to come up, please? I think the idea of a partnership and utilizing market instruments, particularly with regard to carbon markets, is the theme of the set of speakers that have come up here now. I think the idea would be for Switzerland to present Janine Kuriger, I think from SDC in Switzerland. We'll talk about the partnership that you have put in place with Ghana. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present you our collaboration with Ghana on the Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. Actually, I have to change hats because I'm doing this presentation on behalf of our Ministry of Environment, who is the one who is in charge of concluding these agreements. I will start by giving you a little bit of background. Why do we enter into these agreements? As you might be aware, Switzerland has committed to reduce its GHG emissions by 50% by 2030 compared to the 1990 levels. And we do this on the one hand by reducing emissions in Switzerland, but we do also compensate through projects that we finance abroad a part of these obligations. So the agreement that we have signed basically form the basis in order to allow for the transfer of emission reduction credits from a partner country towards Switzerland, and which will then be accounted for our carbon reduction obligations that we have under the Paris Agreement. Can we have the next slide, please? So actually, Switzerland has been a pioneer in concluding these agreements. 6.2, these are the bilateral agreements under the Paris Agreement. We are the first country to have entered into such agreements, and by now we have signed 8, together with Peru, Ghana, Senegal, Georgia, Vanuatu, Dominica, Thailand, and Ukraine. And we are confident that we can sign 3 more this year with Morocco, Malawi, and Uruguay. And as you can see, others are also in the pipeline. So how are we organized actually? So for the implementation, we have a foundation which is in charge of identifying the projects and also doing the whole accompanying of the projects. This is the CLIC Foundation, and the CLIC Foundation actually is a foundation that has been created by the Swiss Petroleum Association, because the Swiss Petroleum Association, they have obligations under the CO2 law in Switzerland to reduce emissions and to compensate them actually by buying carbon credits. So it's an obligation under our CO2 law, and our CO2 law actually is the basis or the framework for Switzerland to really comply and to achieve its NDCs. So on the other hand, besides really having the CLIC Foundation, which is developing the projects together with private partners, we also have entered into an agreement with UNDP, which provides actually technical assistance to develop carbon market readiness with the partner countries with which we have signed agreements, so that they also have the capacity and the necessary inventories in place in order to allow for the exchange of carbon credits. Next slide, please. So actually, what is the motivation for Switzerland, or why do we believe it makes sense to actually enter into such bilateral agreements? First of all, we do believe that carbon markets have the potential to significantly enhance global climate action and also mobilize private funding. I think we have heard it this morning. There's a huge funding gap still out there in terms of climate finance, and it's clear that this gap cannot be closed by only through only public funding. So we really have to get also private funds into action. Then we also believe that Article 6 project can introduce a new quality of carbon credits. Last year at the COP in Glasgow, it has been agreed that no double counting can happen. That means if a project is being financed in one country and credits are transferred, it can only be accounted for in the country that has invested into these projects. So I think that's really important, because otherwise we don't have any positive effects in terms of mitigation really taking place. And the last point is really that we believe it's a way to engage with partner countries in this Article 6 agreement, also to unlock early mitigation action from our side, and which helps us actually also to reach our further goal, which is to become net zero by 2050. And with this, I would like to hand over to Peter, who will provide you with more information about the collaboration that we concretely have initiated in Ghana. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Jenny. As she has said, for us in Ghana, we already have a target of about 64 million metric tons of CO2 and its equivalent to reduce by 2030. And we have set aside 23 million metric tons for the carbon markets. To achieve this, we were looking out for partners to enter into agreements so that we could trade in emissions. And we were fortunate to have the government of Switzerland extending to us an invitation to enter into this agreement. So we entered into the agreement in November 2020 with Switzerland to trade in emissions, as Jenny has said. And in 2021, we ratified same by our parliament. Implementation has commenced with the CLIC Foundation, which is an association of Swiss motor fuel importers. And the sectors that we are looking at, or the programs that we're looking at in terms of carbon trading with Switzerland, include what is known as the National Clean Energy Program, consisting of waste programs, renewable energy programs, and then also clean cooking. Now, outside the NSEP, we have what is known as the alternate wetting and drying program, which we are doing with the government of Switzerland, but this time not with the CLIC Foundation, but with technical assistance from the UNDP. Our goal is to achieve 2.3 million tons of CO2 for each modes through our cooperation with the government of Switzerland. Maybe next slide, yes. So I would now want to talk about our methane reduction program through climate smart agriculture with the alternate wetting and drying program that we are implementing with technical assistance from the UNDP and with the government of Switzerland. This particular program is aimed to commence this year and to end in the next 7 years. The idea is that we want to reduce about 1.3 metric tons of CO2 and its equivalent in the next 7 years with this program. And we are currently targeting about 23,000 hectares of land, rice farms. For the first year, we are looking at 700,000 hectares of rice farms, and we are starting with 100 farmers. In fact, the target are cooperatives, large commercial farmers, and large individual farmers. So these are the three groups of farmers that are being targeted. It is expected that those farmers will be trained, and at the end of the day, we should be able to reduce methane from the rice fields by trying to manage the water that is pumped onto these fields. In terms of, next slide, please. So we have learned a number of lessons through our cooperation agreement with Switzerland. We have learned to understand that it is possible to use carbon trading as an entry point to get people to adapt to technology through this process. The second important point is that before you can trade in carbon, it is important to have established national framework. You need to have an established national framework. You need to have a governance systems well established before you can go into carbon trading. And the third lesson we've learned is that you can use existing methodologies, either from the gold standards or from the CDM. Because as it is now under Article 6.2, we currently do not have our own standards. So we can adapt standards from existing technologies and methodologies that have been approved by the UNFCCC and other recognized international bodies. Next slide. Just quickly to run you through the process that you need to go through if you want to participate in the Ghana-Switzerland agreement. The first thing is that if you are an activity owner, you need to develop your activity idea and you submit that to the Ministry of Environment for a letter of intent to be issued. When the letter of intent is issued, it then allows you to go and start project development. Now, when you do your project development, you develop your mitigation activity design document, and then you bring it and you get what we call authorization. Now, authorization has to be done by both parties. Authorization has to be done by the government of Ghana and also by the government of Switzerland. Now, once you have authorization, you move to implementation on the ground. When you start implementation, you will monitor and ensure that we issue verification reports. Now, the verification reports we call the positive examination statements, which has to be issued by both countries. And in that statement, we will talk about how the monitoring, reporting, and verification was done over the period. We also look at issues relating to double counting, which Jenny had alluded to earlier on, and the fact that issues of human rights violation have not been encountered in the process of delivering the project. This has to be in the statement of positive examination that has to be issued by both countries. Once the statement is issued, the activity owner will request for transfer of mitigation outcomes. And once you request for the transfer, we would make the necessary corresponding adjustments in our both registries. And when we do the adjustments, then the ITMOs are then recognized. It is only at that point that payments can be done for the ITMOs that have been generated. So this is what you have to go through if you want to participate in the current cooperation agreement that we have with the government of Switzerland in the area of ITMO. I think that's the last slide. Thank you very much. And I will now invite the Executive Director of EPA to also make some statements.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Moderator, colleague, analysts. The Environmental Protection Agency of Ghana, being the technical arm and implementation agency of the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology, and Innovation, have developed the needed data platforms, including carbon registry. And then also we've established Article 6 Secretariat, and then the frameworks have been developed. Done all this to ensure the success implementation of the Ghana-Swiss agreement in this direction. To this end, the Environmental Protection Agency of Ghana is poised to ensure that we deliver to achieve the intended purposes of the agreement. It is then necessary to invite all potential partners to come on board, since we are very much convinced that this is the positive way to go to have a win-win situation in the fight against climate change. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Janine, Peter, and Henry. It is very clear that the opportunities that are created through the bilateral agreements that Switzerland is putting in place, and you saw the list in the slides from Janine on the large number of countries in which Switzerland is moving forward. There are similar arrangements being put place and partnerships by Sweden. I believe Singapore is exploring partnerships Japan has had a partnership going on for a long time to utilize the framework of the carbon markets in order to move mitigation activity forward. As Peter was describing, these are complex processes, but with the partnership of Switzerland, UNDP, and other partners, I think substantial progress is being made, and we look forward to keeping track of how Ghana moves this forward. You're among the leaders, both of you, Switzerland and Ghana, and certainly it's of great interest to the broader community as well. Moving now a little bit to the role of the private sector and partnerships in accessing financing for the agriculture sector. I'd like to turn to Jay Waldvogel.
Stick with Jay. It's safe.
Okay, Jay, safe. Thank you. And Jay is the Senior Vice President for the Dairy Farmers of America, and love to hear your perspective on how private sector engagement can lead to much larger investment. So over to you, Jay.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for a wonderful story. That's a fantastic program. I'll be sure to find you at lunch. I'm here representing two different groups. In fact, it's my day job working for Dairy Farmers of America, which is a large US-based dairy cooperative, but also as a member of the board of directors of the Global Dairy Platform, which is a global industry group made up of the largest commercial players in the dairy sector around the world. And I want to touch on two different examples of financing and how it's critical to accelerating and initiating, if you will, the activities to reduce methane around the world. In the first, I'll talk about the US. And the key thing, of course, in the US, as a developed market, we have a very established and efficient and full value chain for dairy, from the farmers through the process to the market. An understood regulatory environment that isn't perfect, but that does support what we do. That is getting pressure both in terms of the penalties for not addressing climate issues, but also the opportunities from the market to address climate issues. The challenge is going fast enough. As we've heard from previous speakers, there's a need for speed. There's a burning platform to address. And in this case, financing is available, but it's never quite enough to go. And so it was great to see. And I want to congratulate the work of the USDA in their Climate Smart Commodities program. So what you see is that when you put an accelerant, when you put that additional funding into an established value chain, you can get very quick action. And what that accelerant is allowing my company to do and our sector to do is to significantly speed up the targets that are already in place. We have targets as a company, we have targets as a US dairy sector, we have targets as a global dairy sector, which I'll talk to in a moment. And for us, that enables them to help build capabilities and capacities as they invest in academia and support. And it allows us as a company to speed our development of climate smart markets, which will then create value that we can use to put back to our farmers to further invest in future initiatives. So an example of where a mature value chain can be sped up dramatically with financial support. I want to compare and contrast that with our second example, is where the Global Dairy Platform, working together as a commercial group, working as a private sector, is active initially in East Africa with a program we call Dairy Nourishes Africa. And for those interested in more, I will be in the joint sessions later today talking both about the global commitment dairy has to net zero, but also the specific work we're doing in Africa. And in that instance, it hits on some of the conversations that were in the initial panel today. That is, many countries out there that have commitments don't have a basis in fossil fuels. And for them to deliver on their commitments, it's important that they find pathways through agriculture. And livestock is a big part of that. Rice is a big part, livestock is a big part. And the speakers this morning talked about trying to find ways to help those countries be successful, to give them a sense of the fact they have a pathway. And so we're working there to find ways to develop the dairy sector that can deliver on those targets. And the key for us is understanding that you have to build this holistic, successful value chain. Again, what makes markets like the US able to accelerate is that the chain exists. If you talk about other conversations earlier today, the idea that you have to have focus on production, which our program does. If you don't have a value chain, that production initiative won't live. It's fantastic that the Global Methane Hub is investing in technologies to get methane inhibitor feed additives. That's a fantastic initiative. It will help globally. But if you go to a developed market and you go to a farmer and you ask him to use that and he doesn't have the training to know how to use it, or more importantly, he doesn't have a market to sell the resulting milk because there's not a processor, or doesn't have consumers because there's not a regulatory environment that supports that, that initiative will not have the effect you want. So the work we're doing in East Africa at the moment is trying to build those entire value chains. So when you have mitigation opportunities, whether it's in productivity or whether it's how you process the milk, you've created this fertile environment for it to actually take hold. Not be a one-off investment, but something again that can create the circular economy, create that virtuous cycle as we talked about in developed markets. And the last thing I'll talk about on that, that's a challenge in these markets that gets to the conversation earlier about financing, is these markets are so immature in the case of dairy, so fragmented. Tanzania, a market we work in quite aggressively, for example, is still 95 to 97% dairy in formal markets. Is too small to attract some of the outside investment that you need. Ticket sizes are too small. The transaction costs are too high. So to build that value chain, you have to make that early investment so that when you get these mitigation tools, they have a place to serve. And the critical statement I would make is that all the things we can do as a dairy sector, as a critical part of methane inside the broader global footprint, in the developed world are about 20% of our total emissions. I have full confidence we have pathways to get to net zero on that, commitments to get to net zero, ways to finance that. But the wave is coming from the emerging markets, the developing markets, where you've got 80% and growing populations whose priority is not reducing their footprint, it's nutritional security, it's resilience. If we can spend the time up front to build those value chains, to prepare the ground for these mitigating tools to actually work, we will save ourselves being here in 5 or 10 years, talking about the next urgency, the next urgency. So for us, finding methods to finance, and we've looked at carbon credits, and our challenge is we can reduce emission intensity, but in a growing market, it's hard to find the actual reduction in absolutes. But if we can bring those things together, that would actually create an environment where we can solve the problems that we're dealing to.
Thank you, Jay. Those were extremely insightful, moving towards creation of value chain, integrating markets in order to prepare for an eventual net zero agricultural sector. I think those are very insightful, and thank you for those remarks. From oil and gas sector, we had discussion around more agriculture and partnership-based approaches. We'll now move to the third panel, but there's a video in between. So while the video goes on, I again want to thank the panelists, and we'll have a transition to the last set of.
Hi, my name is Gonzalo Muñoz, high-level champion for COP25, and I would like, of course, to thank the Climate and Clean Air Coalition for inviting me to speak to all of you about the global methane in this Climate and Clean Air Forum 2022. Of course, for all of us, methane has become a major topic in relation not only to the climate, but also in relation to the different areas of the economy that it touches directly. I'm referring not only, of course, to the importance of reducing the methane emissions in the oil and gas industry, but also in all the food production. I myself, I'm part of the global food banking network. We're also positioning methane as one of the reasons, additionally to hunger and nutrition, why we need to keep on addressing the importance of food loss and food loss and waste, and stop reducing it. When it comes to the mechanism of financing these solutions, where we're seeing how circular economy in general is being positioned much more into the center of the agenda. Not that long ago was a topic that probably very few people was understanding properly. And now we're seeing from public policies, like in my home country in Chile, we're tackling drastically the organic elements in relation to waste. And in that sense, positioning all the capacity of the waste collection systems in a way that can not only reduce that waste being one that is generating methane, but also one that is now capable of improving the education and the culture of the whole of the society. Nowadays, we can see how citizens can learn much more about the importance of segregating the waste at their homes in different places, while starting by segregating the organic waste. All those systems will require a lot of financing for establishing the right mechanisms in their households. Then, of course, all the mechanisms for transporting that organic material. But then at the end, it will mean that that material will become raw material for hopefully biodigesters or composting facilities that are now expecting to receive the right type of financing. Same thing happens when you address all the failures of the food system, a food system that is broken, that we need to fix. We need to fix when it comes to regenerative agriculture and forestry, all the mechanisms that will allow us to improve our relationship with nature, but then reducing the mechanisms or the emissions on the mechanisms that allow us to harvest and then process our food and finally transport it. And at the end, as I said, reduce all the mechanisms that are generating now a lot of food and loss in different parts of the world. We have seen that increasing in terms of activity, also coming from the brands, the retailers that are now positioning their need on reducing food waste and loss. And not only, again, because of the financial merit that it generates, but also because of the methane that they can reduce, and therefore that links very properly to their climate commitments. So in many aspects, we're seeing not only from the northern countries, but also from the global south, how circular economy, climate are mechanisms and general topics that are increasing the commitments on reduction of methane emissions in the full value chain of food production. Well, thank you very much. Looking forward to what will come from the discussion, and definitely looking forward to meeting you in person the next time.
That was Gonzalo Munoz, the high-level champion for COP25. Let's now move to the final panel, where the focus would be to present some ideas and to reflect on what you've heard. I'll first go to Carolina Urmenta, the Circular Economy Program Director of the Global Methane Hub. And Carolina, you had a shout out from Jay. I'd love to hear more about the, the Global Methane Hub and the work that it does, and how you see the work of the hub tying in with what you've heard in the earlier panel. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, and happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And yes, the Global Methane Hub is a philanthropic effort in order to support the countries that has signed the pledge and the ones that are going to join also to reduce methane emission. We are working in relation with policy in order to have more policy, to have more regulation, to have laws if necessary. Also in MRB, and we talk about a lot about transparency. We're working in order to leverage finance, and we're working in the main three sectors, energy, agriculture, and waste. And specifically on waste, I think we have a really good project that maybe it's important also to talk, which is a methane accelerator program. We're working in Latin America in 6 countries, which are Costa Rica, Chile, Dominican Republic, Peru, Mexico, and Uruguay. We're working with the Center for Clean Air Policy and also Implementa Sur. And the project aims to support or to bring technical support to the local governments, because in waste you need to work with local governments to develop and to bring technical support for assistance in order to develop, for example, pre-feasibility studies, to present that information to the financial institution, because That is what we need in order to have implementation, to have projects, and to have action. We aim to have around 50 organic waste management projects and to design or to do the analysis of 15 pre-feasibility studies and 5 engineering projects for composting plants. With this, what I think is important is that we need to have these pre-feasibility studies in a quality that is good to be presented to the financial institution. And it's not necessary to have, of course, we need all the information and complete information, but we know how to do this. We know how to calculate the mitigation, the emission reduction. So we could present that and the financial institutions could use that. We have good examples, for example, and we heard some of that, about, for example, green bonds or sustainability linked bonds that are reported with transparency by the governments, and they have really good results on that. So we could use that. And that is and what I think it's also important in this discussion is that we have a lot of instruments that works for different realities and different regions and different countries. For example, we have the bonds. For example, we have loans. For example, we have credits, and we also have carbon markets, and it's the combination of that instruments that we could use in order to go to methane reduction. I think it's really important to understand that we need to work with the governments and the organizations that are in the territories. Because if we came with one solution, well, that would not work. We need to understand the different realities and we need to work with them. And also, I'm happy to announce or to tell you that we are working also with the UN climate champion. We were here in like COP25 champion, but here was also COP27 champion, and we are working with them in order to include methane in each breakthrough, because they are working also with the non-state actors, and we need them also in this, like big picture to get this methane reduction. I think, and just I'm finishing with that, I think we need to make this mobilization in order to have finance. We need to work with the governments in order to have regulation. And it's really important to have a good and transparent tracking system. We need MRV. We're going to have on 2024, the first biennial transparency report. Governments must use that as an instrument for the finance world, because we are going to have that information. So we don't need to build everything like starting it's everything is new. We have the instrument. We need to use it for what we want, that is methane reduction. So that is what I want to share with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now let me turn to Johan Kulistierna. He's at research leader at SEI and part of the CCAC Scientific Advisory Panel. If you could talk a little bit about the engagement based on the experience of engagement with countries on how to make programs more effective based on your experience, that would be.
Thank you very much. So been involved in supporting a number of countries, about 30 countries under the national planning activities of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And some of the countries have been right through the process of developing national plans. And this process has involved, all parts of government, lots of stakeholder consultation to identify a list of priority measures that are then, as part of this planning or as part of the NDC, endorsed at a high political level within the countries. So, so far so good. We have priority measures which would, and we have an understanding of what emission reduction would be, either in terms of methane or in terms of other short-lived climate pollutants, or indeed greenhouse gases and air pollutants. it's all quantified there in terms of what the benefit would be. So with those countries that have that political endorsement, we've got the task now of implementing those actions. So in terms of financing those actions, there needs to be both the allocation of national budgets and the mobilization of international finance. So for the national budgets, the countries, from the start of the planning process, they've involved the ministries of finance, and they've also been working with the ministries responsible for the different sectoral emissions. All right. And so the proposals have been developed with these sectoral ministries for national budget allocations. The problem has been, I think, that they're not always successful when the ministries of environment are competing for funds with the other ministries. And that's often the case when it comes to environmental matters. So it seemed to me that mobilizing the high-level political will in those countries is now very important. And I wonder whether we've really mobilized that political will using all of the stakeholders engaged within the Climate and Clean Air Coalition or other bodies to really raise the profile of these priority actions which have been identified in the context of national decision making. So one aspect, I think you touched on this, Carolina, with regard to accessing the international finance, which is going to be also required. Many countries find that process of developing high quality proposals which have a chance of being successful quite difficult. And not all countries have the capacity and the experience to develop those. So maybe going forward, support can be provided to help those countries to develop those and make, as you were saying, increase the chance of accessing those funds. So I think that those are some of the insights we've got.
Thank you. And the segue to Helen is quite obvious. Helen Mirovic is with IDB Invest, the private sector arm of IDB, and head of the climate change advisory services. So we now rely on you to make sense of the financing landscape that Carolina talked about and which Johan thinks is important to make it all a success. So we rely on you for the next 5 minutes to solve all the problems.
Is it on? Yeah. Yeah, so first of all, I just wanted to tell you that Carolina was looking at me because we were chatting before the session about different instruments and things that are moving forward, and we're moving forward to finance not only actions on methane, but also on climate in general. So she was looking at me because we had that's basically putting a lot of pressure on me. And I think Johan also just, the mobilization comes back again and again and again. So let me start by saying I have 3 messages that I wanted to share with you. I think that Bella gave a very good example of where the financial flows are going. I just wanted to explain to you what's happening at the MDB levels, many of the conversations that we have at the MDBs, and how we can link it to methane reductions. The second point that I wanted to talk about is more about what's happening with the mobilization and institutional investors and all this capital that comes from outside. But how do we foster action with companies that are basically selling their products and their value chains are only local or domestic? And I was interested and intrigued by Jay's comments because my example was from dairy companies in Latin America that only sell milk domestically. But I'll get to that. And the third point that I want to mention to you guys is the issue of how we are innovating and mobilizing resources for climate action, and how many times the private sector is moving faster than the public sector. But we're taking the lessons from those actions and those financing, for example, the sustainability-linked bonds and others, to bring it to the public sectors and the governments to be able to raise the funds that are needed. So let me start from the first point. MDBs, we all have or started at some point with commitments to climate financing. And that meant that we had 30, 40, 50% of our financing needed to be geared towards climate investments and climate actions with an agreed methodology that all MDBs said these are the types of investments that we should promote. That has helped quite a lot with promoting investments in renewable energy, for example, in Latin America. But the truth is that many times when we get asked, oh, so now how much of methane reduction have you achieved? We don't have those tools necessarily in place. So believe it or not, we are only this year having a specific tool to quantify the emission reductions that we're achieving through our climate investments, because we are monitoring, at least in the private sector arm of the IDB group, how much we're financing and then how much are we actually reducing with that financing. And in the conversation with the Global Methane Pledge, we said, well, now we have to actually figure out how much of that is methane. But we don't have the tools yet. We're starting to develop those to be able to actually say how much of this is methane related. But of course, I think the challenge, again, is that the renewable energies projects of this world are already commercial. We don't really need to be there at this point. Probably in 2013, 2010, we did have a role there as an MDB, not anymore. So our target or our area to work is actually waste management or sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, and based on the examples that Ghana gave, which are very interesting, is to support low carbon rice production in the region. And that will be fostered with this new target that most of the MDBs have, is that most of our lending, or 100% in the case of IDB Group, of our lending from 2023 onward has to be Paris aligned. So that means that we will have to see how the investment, specific investment that we're doing will be aligned with the NDC, will be aligned with the long-term strategy, will be aligned with the global standards of emission reductions in specific sectors. That's what happens at the MDBs, and I think it's a good set of incentives for team leaders and investment officers to seek those investments and to attract and mobilize resources for this kind of engagements. But then, and this is based on the experience, many times we have some type of resistance of investment officers that when they talk to our clients, private sector clients in the region, they say, well, when we try to promote, for example, sustainable agriculture, and this is the second example that I was going to give you, in the case that the dairy producing company only sells milk in the domestic market, and there is no legislation or no plan, national plan to support the emission reduction in that sector, there is very little way of moving the needle in that case. So we do have the performance standards and we apply the sustainability policy. But if we want to ask for more, or if we want to say, why don't you do a net zero strategy, decarbonization strategy, they say, what for? When we talk with companies that mobilize or have, they basically trade internationally, or they have resources from European companies, it's easier to link it to the EU taxonomy. It's easy to link it to what's happening in the international market, because we can sell the pitch. We do the pitch of, if you do this, you will be able to diversify your investment base. You can attract institutional investors that do have a target on net zero or mobilizing resources. And so you can be one of those projects that taps into that target. But when they do not access international financing, it's harder. And so basically, I just would repeat what Jay said, to work on the value chains locally, which is not an easy task, but I think it's a very important task. That working together with partnerships in public and private partnership, we need to support those value chains for the companies, the milk companies, or the companies that only sell locally to replicate and to do that. And there are some very interesting examples in the region, and there are very committed people, for example, doing sustainable agriculture or sustainable cattle ranching, that have seen that doing that it positioned themselves as a differential in the market. And so that's a way to promote the movement. And finally, my last point has to do with the instruments. So how do we do that? And so, yes, the sustainability linked bonds, it's something that ICMA, the International Capital Markets Association, has already the criterion, what's the sustainability linked bond. For those of you that do not know, it's basically a company will say, I commit to reducing X amount of emissions, either intensity or absolute emissions by 2030. And if I do that, I get, if I do not comply with that, I could get a step up. So it's more expensive for me as a company. But if I do it, or if I achieve it, I achieve it in a shorter term, I get a step down. So of course, companies are very interested in getting a step down, but they will work very, very hard to get it to avoid the step up. So those are the sustainability linked bonds. They have been used quite a lot in the private sector, and as the IDB, the IDB part of the IDB group has worked, for example, recently with Uruguay and are about to present it in the London Stock Exchange, the first sustainability linked bond that not only has a step up, yes, as the Chile one did, which was also the first sovereign sustainability linked bond. But the one that with Uruguay will have a step down, and the investors are interested in that. And part of the step down will be linked to actually sustainable agriculture because of Uruguay and where they are and what kind of production they have. So it's a very interesting case to be watching that will include the methane reduction. And what IDB is doing with them is basically working in supporting them, creating the pipeline of projects. Because again, and many times when we work either with local banks, commercial banks in the region, or with this type of governments that want to do this type of bonds, is what's the pipeline behind it? How can you help me create that pipeline? And so the IDB is working with the government to create that pipeline. So I think in short, what I want to say is that we are all here innovating and trying to bring the examples from the private sector to the public sector. We want to mobilize more resources and bring institutional investors. And generally, when you have institutional investors that are in developed markets, they will know that this is important, and it's a driving force. What we are missing right now is not only working with the value chains, but the last thing is to work with domestic capital markets to be able to replicate those lessons in domestic markets. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very insightful and very useful to hear those promising developments that are taking place, at least in sustainability linked financing. So I have the challenging task of trying to summarize the last 90 minutes of conversation that has taken place here. To me, the idea of trying to move the financing is stands out, right? I mean, this is the biggest challenge, and the whole theme around the discussion was on financing. And we heard that the financing is inadequate, needs to grow dramatically, and needs to be a focus if we are to achieve some of the impacts that methane and SLCPs can have on reducing the risk of climate change. What is very clear is that the governments, you heard from Nigeria, from Ghana, from others, that government action is important to create an enabling environment, but certainly attracting the private sector requires regulation, enabling regulation, sometimes framing regulations which incentivize action. Certainly carbon pricing, for instance, in the oil gas sector would be particularly important to move towards reducing impacts of things like methane. And certainly a emerging change of mindset that was talked about, not just in the oil and gas sector, but also in the agricultural sector, of creating value chains and focusing on creation of value chains so that effective implementation can move forward, particularly as far as financing is concerned. And you've heard ideas with regard to financing, from the carbon markets to sustainability linked financing with measurable KPIs, with step up and step down, which makes financing much more attractive. And I will also give a shout out while I have the privilege here. The World Bank is working with Banco do Brazil on decarbonizing the agricultural supply chain through a $500 million credit line, with basically mirrors what Helen just mentioned in terms of KPIs linked to actual reductions, which give you a step down on the rates. So it's a very exciting area. We see a change where, at least for the multilaterals, climate finance and development finance are becoming synonymous. The challenge for us is to blend the various forms of financing that's available, from carbon finance to grant to sustainability linked finance, to deliver on impact to the clients. And if we are to learn from how the renewable energy or energy transition is progressing, I think that's an important idea to keep in mind as we try to move towards decarbonization of agriculture, of oil and gas, and many other sectors which have methane and SLCPs there. So very promising area, and I hope you've benefited from this. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for Q&As, but the hope is that you've heard from the panelists, and there will be an opportunity in the networking sessions for you to have bilateral conversations to understand more. But with that, please join me in thanking all the participants for their contribution.